Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Vaeth, and I am honored to be the host of this panel on ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. I'd like to thank the Boomer Esiason Foundation and the Pioneer Institute for sponsoring this event. Our discussion today is extremely important, and it's also extremely timely, because currently as a nation, rightfully so, we're focused on the issue of equality. And moral decency says that all individuals, regardless of health status or disability, should be considered equal. And yet ICER disagrees with that. And they push out reports and analysis that state that those with illnesses and disabilities are not as valuable, not equal to that of healthy individuals. And so our panel today, we will focus on that. We'll largely look at it through the lens of cystic fibrosis, a genetic disease. Many of us on this panel, we have a personal connection to CF. Me specifically, my youngest daughter, Porter, she's 6 years old. She has cystic fibrosis. I do want to mention too that what ICER is doing, it doesn't just affect those with CF. It affects countless of other Americans who are currently fighting an illness or trying to gain access to a life-saving treatment. So today we'll have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Bill Smith, an expert on the issue of ICER, Gunnar Esiason, an adult living with CF, and Siri Vaeth, a mother of a child with CF who has had some personal experiences dealing with ICER. And at the end, we'd love to hear from you, the audience, so we'll open it up to some question and answer. So with that, our first speaker is Dr. Bill Smith. He is a visiting fellow at the Pioneer Institute in Massachusetts, and he really is one of the leading voices when it comes to bringing to light the many, many flaws of ICER. He has 25 years of experience in government and in corporate roles. His career includes staff positions at the White House, in the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and in the Massachusetts Governor's Office. He spent 10 years at ICER as Vice President of Public Affairs and Policy, and he earned his PhD in political science at the Catholic University of America. Dr. Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, I'm unmuted, I think. Thank you, Mary. Honored to be here, honored to partner with the Boomer Esiason Foundation and be on a panel with two distinguished advocates. I am not a CF expert, so I'm going to talk more about sort of my general problems with the ICER methodology, how it affects different populations, and I'll leave it to the other panelists to talk about some of the CF specific issues. But as Mary referenced, I think the ICER model disadvantages certain populations. So I'm going to talk about those, and I'll talk a little bit about how the ICER model is really just not an adequate model to rate rare disease drugs or value rare disease drugs. The model just doesn't fit it quite well. And I'll try to finish on a happy note. You read a lot of stories about how new drugs coming out for rare diseases are unaffordable. That is just simply not true, and I'll explain some of the data around that. So ICER is a nonprofit organization. It was started by the health insurance industry, and their goal is to establish somewhat objective value for different therapies. They use a model that's very common in Europe called quality adjusted life years. And what the quality adjusted life years methodology does is it rates therapies according to their ability to extend life and to improve the quality of life. Now, in the abstract, that sounds great. You know, of course, we would want new drugs to extend life and improve the quality of life. But like many things that sound good in the abstract, when you try to implement them, they become a challenge. And let me just talk quickly about two populations where it's challenging. Let's say older Americans, for example. Let's say you have two people. You have Ed, who is 70 years old, and you have Bill, who's 30 years old. They have different disease conditions, both of which are terminal. They're going to die in the next year or two, and they need some kind of a therapy to improve their longevity. And again, ICER rates things according to their ability to extend life. So say two medicines are developed. One is going to get Ed from 70 to 80. It's a new medicine. He's going to get 10 more years of life. He's very thrilled. He's going to get to see his grandchildren. A new medicine is developed for Bill. He's going to get from 30 to 80. He's going to get 50 years more and live a whole life, have a family, do many of the things he wanted to do. This is good news all the way around. But in ICER's methodology, because Bill's life is extended for 50 more years and Ed's life is only extended for 10 more years, Bill's drug is going to be rated much more highly and much more cost effective than Ed's drug, and is much more likely to make it on a formulary somewhere. Now, as far as Ed's concerned, that drug is very valuable to him. He's going to get 10 years of life with his grandchildren, and he doesn't understand why, as an older person, his drug would be more devalued than a drug for a younger person. So that's one challenge of this longevity criteria in the ICER model. Let's look at the quality of life, the other 50% of the way ICER rates drugs, and how that impacts the disabled. And imagine, again, two different patients with different conditions. Mary they're both in their mid-40s. Mary has a condition where she's has a disability. She's, say, confined to a wheelchair, and she's likely not to live very much longer. The same is true for Jane. She has a different condition, confined to a wheelchair, and she's not likely to live much longer. And then two therapies are developed to treat each of their conditions. One gets Mary out of her wheelchair. She's going to live till 80. She's going to have a good quality of life and a long life. Great. This drug is going to get a big score according to ICER. Jane has a therapy developed for her condition that doesn't solve her entire disability problem. She's still going to have mobility issues, but she's going to live to 80. Now, according to the ICER methodology, Mary's drug is going to be much more highly rated than Jane's drug. And Jane might even be threatened with not getting her drug because it's rated not as cost effective. Now, is that fair to Jane? She's going to live till 80 if she gets this drug. That's the problem when it comes to the disability community, is when you're disabled, you're never going to have necessarily 100% quality of life cure that comes along. You might improve your condition a little bit, but if you still have some of that disability, your drug is going to be scored as less valuable than a different drug for somebody who's not disabled. And that's a real problem, a discrimination problem for those living with disabilities that I have a big concern with. So those are the two populations, older Americans and people living with disabilities, where the ICER model disadvantages them. But let's jump into rare diseases, because CF is considered an orphan disease. It has a prevalence of less than 200,000 people. And the ICER model, it creates great challenges for these types of disease states. Let's talk about the business model. I was in the pharmaceutical industry. I do understand the business. The business model for developing rare disease therapies is quite different than for developing therapies like for hypertension, where there might be 50 million patients who have the condition. And the reason for that is very simple. There's a small number of customers. Products that are very expensive to develop and have a small number of customers tend to have very high prices. I don't care whether it's a very difficult surgery that's only going to be performed 20 times a year, that's going to be very expensive, or even an Italian sports car that's handmade that only 50 people in the world can afford. But products that are very expensive to develop and have very few customers are going to be expensive. And that's a problem in the rare disease space. And in fact, in the 1970s, there's some unbelievable data. In the 1970s, the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry didn't even look to develop rare disease drugs because they thought that this was not a profitable market. It couldn't possibly be. There's not enough customers. And so in the 1970s, believe it or not, on the market, there were only 10 drugs for rare diseases that were marketed. So in the early 1980s, Congress passed what was called the Orphan Drug Act, and they provided certain incentives for companies to develop rare disease drugs. And the science changed also. We got more knowledge of the human genome and other things. And what we've seen since then is an explosion in rare disease drugs. As compared with the 70s, where there were only 10 marketed rare disease drugs, now there are 830 rare disease drugs on the market. And the trends are more and more rare disease drugs are being developed. More than half of the drugs that were approved by the FDA in both 2018 and 2019 were for orphan or rare diseases. So there's been an explosion, and the trends are really strong in this direction. This is where the industry is going. Gene therapy, cell therapy, the technology is exploding for rare disease drugs. And it's very promising, but there's a long way to go. There are 8,000 rare diseases, and we probably have treatments for about 340 of those. So we have a long way to go. And the last thing you want is ICER to step on the hose and crimp the pipeline for these new therapies. So you still do have the ICER model is, in my view, is not adequate to capturing the value of rare disease drugs. And that's in part because their cost is always going to be higher. And they don't rate them that much differently than other drugs. They still say a drug, for example, that gets a decent score under the ICER model that costs it less than $50,000 is going to be cost effective, very highly cost effective. One that costs between $50,000 and $175,000 is going to be of intermediate value, and anything over $175,000 is going to be of low value. Now, knowing the economics of the rare disease world, those thresholds are not really adequate to capturing some of these products. You know, a rare disease, you know, a gene therapy for a patient population where there's only 2,000 patients with that condition, we're seeing numbers of $600,000 or $700,000 for those treatments. And maybe that's the right number. Maybe it should be less. Maybe it's the right number that the company has put out. You know, that I'm not going to cast judgments on each of these individually. But in my view, the ICER model and thresholds don't capture those diseases and the economics of the rare disease model. And if the ICER methodology would be adopted in a widespread way, many of these treatments wouldn't be paid for. And in fact, you know, this is not just my opinion. There was a study in 2014 in the Journal of Comparative Effectiveness, which is an economic journal, that basically said the whole cost effectiveness models need to change for these rare diseases that are coming down the pike. And there was a study published in Health Affairs in 2018 that looked at ICER's reviews of all the rare disease drugs between 2014 and 2018. And it found that none, zero, were rated a high value therapy. So there's a bias in the model against rare diseases, which is very problematic. So I'm somewhat accepting of the fact that rare disease drugs are going to be expensive. And I'm going to close on this point. So a lot of people out there must be thinking, how can we afford this? How can we afford a $400,000 medication? Isn't this going to break the healthcare system? And when you read the media accounts of drug costs and all these things, you think, oh, this is impossible. We're never going to be able to pay for these things. And actually, that's not true. And the reason for that is that we're seeing many expensive branded drugs lose their patent protection, and their prices are dropping through the floor. So when I was at Pfizer, the greatest selling drug of all time was called Lipitor. It was a statin for lowering cholesterol. It sold for $3 to $4 a pill. It sold to millions of people. It made $95 billion in sales when it was a branded drug. I was told by a health insurance executive a few months ago that the price of Lipitor, now that it has gone generic, has dropped from $4 a pill to 4 cents a pill. So what's happening is there's enormous savings cascading through the healthcare system and in the pharmacy budgets in particular, that is providing billions of dollars in savings. In 2019, the savings were estimated to be $26 billion from generics. In the 5 years moving forward, the savings are estimated to be $96 billion. And because of this, drug prices and drug costs have collapsed. There was one study that came out of the White House that said drug costs are actually 0.7% lower. Now, the White House tried to take credit for that, and maybe there's some things that they did, and I think there's some things that Scott Gottlieb and others did that may have helped with that. But largely, it's due to this generic trend. And that generic trend is going to continue, and that's flattened out the cost of drugs. So even with these new, highly expensive rare disease drugs coming online and getting approved, drug costs are not growing. These things are affordable by payers because they're seeing enormous savings in their pharmacy budgets. So I'm going to close on that happy note.
Thank you, Bill. We know that you don't have a direct link to CF, but we appreciate all that you're doing on behalf of the community. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Our next guest is Gunnar Esiason. He is an adult living with cystic fibrosis. And Gunnar comes from, in my mind, hands down, the most influential family when it comes to helping those with CF and working to fight against the disease. Both his parents, his dad, Boomer Esiason, his sister, and of course, himself, they've worked tirelessly through the Boomer Esiason Foundation to help combat CF. Gunnar is 29 years old, and he is the Director of Patient Outreach at the Boomer Esiason Foundation. He was diagnosed with CF at the age of 2, and he graduated from Boston College and is currently an MBA, MPH candidate at Dartmouth. Today, he is thriving on Trikafta, a miracle drug that's helping numerous individuals with CF manage their illness and live life to the fullest. Thank you for joining us, Gunnar.
Thanks, Mary. And thanks, Dr. Bill, for that great opening. So I want to start off a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about the Boomer Esiason Foundation, and I'll sort of weave through cystic fibrosis, and then kind of close on how Trikafta has really influenced my life tremendously. So the Boomer Esiason Foundation, we were founded in 1993 after I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. Since then, we've raised about $150 million in the fight against CF. And a lot of that money has, as you've said, gone towards research, but also clinical improvements. But we take great pride in providing patient financial aid, whether that's through college or graduate school scholarships. And then, of course, we help folks who are going through lung transplants with lung transplant grants. So what is cystic fibrosis? For those people who on this call who may not know what it is, it's a genetic condition that usually manifests in severe respiratory disease. And unfortunately, currently maintains a median age of death of about 30 years old. So the median age of death is, when you look at the number of people with CF who unfortunately pass away in a given year, half those patients are dying before the age of 30, which is a real travesty considering how far we've come. So CF leads to an abundance of thick, sticky mucus that traps harmful bacteria in the lungs, and then eventually it leads to clinical decline and respiratory decline. And frankly, that's where I was. So let's back up to sort of my life with cystic fibrosis. And it's best told through the lens of the story. Heading into my senior year of high school, I was slated to be the starting quarterback on my high school football team. I was pretty excited about it. It was something that I had looked forward to my entire life. Obviously, with my dad's NFL career, I'd always looked up to him, and he had always been my hero, to the point where I always wanted to do something like that. I wanted to be an athlete. I wanted to be a part of something bigger than myself. That's why I played high school football. But leading into my senior year, I developed mononucleosis. And mono is a pretty significant co-infection that can happen with cystic fibrosis, and it led to pretty rapid clinical decline. In fact, it was the first time in my life when I had such a severe decline that I was not able to recover from it like I had always been able to do up to that point in my life. And throughout the summer, I noticed that my body was changing. Not only was it getting more difficult to breathe, I was wasting muscle. I wasn't able to put weight on. And I remember thinking about, okay, I have football season coming up, but what am I going to do to prepare for it? And frankly, there was nothing I could do to prepare for it. I just had to continue to fight not only the mono, but also the infection that it was sort of encouraging in my lungs. So then when football season finally did roll around, preseason, it was, of course, in the middle of August. And after a day or two of preseason practice, it became quite clear that I was in a really tough position. I was likely not going to be the starting quarterback that I had thought I was going to be. And it was something that I had to really manage as a 17-year-old kid. And when you're 17, you're obviously, the emotions flare, and the things that are sitting right in front of your face become the most important things in the world to you. And that's really where I was. I was getting sicker. My friends were getting stronger. And it was a very weird dichotomy. But I tried to fight through it, despite really struggling through the first couple weeks of practice. Then finally, towards the end of preseason, near the end of August, it was a hot summer day, and we were doing some conditioning on the field. Doing wind sprints back and forth, push-ups, that kind of thing. And during a set of push-ups, my arms gave out and I collapsed. And next thing I know, I found myself on the field, kind of rolled over on my back, and the entire team was huddled around me, kind of like looking at me with, eyes as wide as marbles. And I remember kind of thinking to myself, okay, what's going on here? And I was able to kind of pick myself up off the ground, and I looked down, and my entire practice jersey was covered in blood. It was all just red, it was a real nightmare scenario. The trainer was running over, the coach was running over. Everyone wanted to know if Gunnar was okay. And it was really Really pretty scary moment because it was the first time that I had ever coughed up blood. Which turns out is a possible symptom of CF. And with that, I kind of had to shake it off. I had to realize what kind of situation I was in. And I remember all I said was, okay, just call my mom. Someone just call my mom, please, and she'll come and get me. And that's what happened. My trainer was, they were ready to call 911, but I talked them out of it and got my mom on the field. And we went right into New York Presbyterian, my CF center, sat down with the doctor, and we had a conversation about what was happening to me. And she said, Gunnar, we're looking at, rapid progression of cystic fibrosis. This is a thing that we're going to have to really aggressively treat. And I remember thinking that, I'm 17 years old. I want to go to college. What am I doing here? Like, I'm supposed to be playing football with my friends. And that's when she said it. She was like, Gunnar, I think we're going to have to end your football season. You're not going to be able to play for the rest of the year. It's, we're going to have to really hone in and figure out what is going on with your lungs. And we did. Long story short, over the next several months, we sort of treated it aggressively. All the while we were sacrificing very valuable lung function that does not come back in cystic fibrosis. As soon as you lose it, it's pretty much gone once you are living with sustained infection and inflammation. And for me, that was pretty tough to deal with. It was, I remember feeling like something that I had looked forward to my entire life was just suddenly taken from me. But really what it was preparing me for the rest of my adulthood and living with a progressive illness. Over the next several years, my CF continued to progress. To the point where in college, I was able to go to college. My symptoms continued to exacerbate to the point where I needed a feeding tube. I missed God knows how much time of college. And really towards the end of my years at BC, I had been looking forward to going to law school. That was my one goal in getting through BC. And, in hindsight, it feels like it was a misguided dream because I can't imagine having, being a litigator being a dream for someone, but that's where I was. And frankly, when I did graduate from BC, I was so sick that I just was not able to pursue graduate education. Instead, I was forced home. So as a 22-year-old college graduate, I was forced to live in my parents' home. And the independence that I enjoyed in college, all that was taken away from me, in a matter of weeks. And over the course of the next 5 years, I went through some pretty significant hurdles. I sort of survived, 24 different medical procedures, rapidly progressing antibiotic resistance in my lungs. And frankly, it was, that 30 years mark, the median age of death in CF was looking very real as every year, every calendar year turned. Then in 2018, I enrolled into the clinical trial program that eventually led to Trikafta's approval. And it changed my life overnight. In a matter of hours, I could breathe. In a matter of days, the cough that comes with cystic fibrosis evaporated. And in 2 weeks after initially dosing, I went back for my first visit. And my pulmonary function exploded. So you're living your entire life with diminishing lung function. After 2 weeks, it finally took off. It finally went in the other direction for the first time in my entire life. But the best way to tell the benefits of Trikafta is really through my dad's eyes. My dad and I, we play recreational ice hockey together. And through those years when I was very sick, I managed to play as frequently as I could. Albeit it wasn't that frequently. I would get on the ice, I would skate up and down for, 25, 30 seconds, and I'd get off because I'd be, gasping for air, also coughing up mountains and mountains of mucus. But 2 weeks after starting Trikafta, we had our first spring league game. And I'll never forget quite what it was like. I remember being on the ice for the first time and just never getting tired. It was basically a miracle happening in front of my eyes. I had gone, years and years of playing ice hockey, to only being able to be on the ice for 35 seconds at a time, to the point where I could be out there for as long as I wanted because I could suddenly breathe. It was like a parachute had just suddenly fallen off my back, is what it was like. And Trikafta has had those benefits across the patient population of CF. The clinical efficacy of it is unmatched as far as any other CF drug is concerned. But through all that, I had a realization that I had to reinvent myself. I had to invest in my future because the future was something that I could suddenly have. And that's why I went to grad school. And I think, sticking with the theme of hockey, I looked back at my first year at grad school. I played on the club hockey team here, and I was on the ice 50 days out of the school year, which is crazy. From going from being able to play every once in a while, being on the ice for seconds at a time, to being on the ice 50 days out of the year, out of the school years, is just a crazy stat to think about. So when these, when the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review releases these reports and talks about the way cystic fibrosis is, in their mind, it's deeply hurtful to see how these things are written. And the ICER report, on TRIKAFTA does conclude that it does substantially improve patient outcomes, but as Bill said, it doesn't capture the value that it, quote unquote, should, according to their quality model. So the question that I have for them is, I wonder what is more cost effective for society. Is it when I was critically sick, when I was going through months and weeks and time spent going through hospitalizations, procedure after procedure, time spent out of the office, out of work, time spent not socializing with my friends? Is that what's more effective and beneficial to society? Or is it when I'm taking a drug that has saved my life and changed my life and given me a future? That's the question that I have. But beyond that, as I said in my opinion piece in the Morning Consult, the very best parts of life don't have a number attached to them, but according to ICER, the very worst do, right? So a patient with a rare disease or cystic fibrosis has the highest relative value when they die, right? Because we're paying for medications, our insurance, our society is paying for medications to keep us alive. But when we die, that cost goes away. And that's essentially what the quality model is doing. And what I mean by that is that there's no model on this planet that could actually capture the panic that I felt every time I went to the hospital, every time I went through a procedure, or the heart-wrenching medical traumas that I had gone through. Just as there is no economic model on this planet that could capture my path from that point in my life to where I am now, living hundreds of miles from my family home, going to grad school, making new friends, thinking about the rest of my future in my life. Like, there is no model that could accurately capture that. And by ICER's own admission, the quality of life benefits that I have seen are something that falls outside of their model. But for someone living with cystic fibrosis or someone living with a rare disease, is that not the most important part of living with a terminal illness? Enjoying the benefits of life. That's what every single person wants, and every single person in our world deserves, is to be able to enjoy the benefits of life. And that's really what I want. And now I'll close with this before I hand it back to you, Mary. The lived experience of a terminal illness or cystic fibrosis is very personalized. There's no one correct way to live with CF or any chronic illness. Condition manifests in people very differently. The only people who can truly understand what it is like to live with cystic fibrosis are those of us who actually live with it. Anything else is conjecture.
Wow, thank you for that, Gunnar. That very, very powerful testimony. Thank you for sharing that. I've often said that there are few people that we encounter that are stronger than an individual that is fighting an illness like Gunnar, or a parent that is caring for a sick or disabled child. And that's very well represented in our next speaker, Siri Vaeth. She is the mother of a 25-year-old daughter living with cystic fibrosis. And she has used that strength as a parent, caring for a sick child, to advocate on her daughter's behalf and for others living with CF. She is the executive director of the Cystic Fibrosis Research Incorporated, CFRI, and they serve the national CF community by funding research, providing educational and personal support, and advocating for those with CF. Prior to CFRI, she was the executive director of a Big Brothers Big Sisters organization. She holds a master's degree in social welfare from the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's degree in politics from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Siri, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you to the Boomer Esiason Foundation and Pioneer Institute for including me on this panel. It's a great honor, and I thank Bill and Gunnar for your incredible presentations. As the director of CFRI and as the mother of an adult with CF, I absolutely take issue with ICER's methodology and philosophy, because it excludes the patient voice and it leads to assessments that really have the potential to block access to needed therapies. We work closely, CFRI, with other rare disease groups, and I want to note that ICER's use of QALY is not only discriminatory against those with CF, but all people with chronic disease, and its assessments especially penalize the rare disease community, as Phil mentioned. Before I go any further, I'll say in full disclosure that my daughter is on Trikafta, and she is doing really, really well. It's had a great and positive impact on her life. The issue of drug pricing impacts everyone, whether or not one has a rare disease, and properly conducted value assessments are not my issue. My critique is of ICER and its methods, because the patient voice and experience has to play an integral part in any drug value assessment, and patients have to really be at the heart and core of any assessment. In doing so, the nuances of complex diseases will be better understood. Patients can determine what improved health and quality of life means to them, not what other people think it should mean. And the methods and process will be more transparent. I've engaged with ICER twice in the past 2 years, and after these experiences, I believe that ICER lacks a genuine commitment to meaningfully incorporate the patient voice. We've spent a lot of hours trying to inform ICER committee members on the nuances of CF. In the end, the impression is that we are being somewhat used to legitimize ICER's process. And I wish I could downplay their impact. Many people say, oh, ICER's just the mouse that roared. But as a community, we do have much to fear because they are self-ordained. They are not a public institution, but their credibility is built up by the payers that support them, who really have a vested interest in the results of their reports. Last January, ICER released an updated patient participation guide, and on the first page in really big font, they say, quote, ICER listens to patients, ICER values input from all stakeholders, especially patients and patient groups. But unfortunately, that is not translating when you look at their assessments. In 2018, they conducted an evaluation of a CFTR modulator, and many CF groups, CFRI among them, were upset because our name was included in the report as having engaged with this process when in fact we had not. And this made us feel like our names are being used to give credibility to this report. So here comes 2020, well, 2019 when it started, and the next evaluation. And we found ourselves in a very interesting position because ICER seemed to be bending over backward to incorporate CF patient groups. And I have joked about the kinder, gentler ICER, but I really didn't have much faith that the outcome would be different. And so it was very tempting to not participate. We are all in the CF community and our organizations very busy trying to meet the needs of our patients and constituents. It takes a lot of time to engage with ICER. So it was tempting to decline, but I felt like I couldn't make the decision to withhold patients' experiences from this committee. That was my making that decision was not fair. And part of why I wanted to engage was my knowledge that ICER's committees, they purposefully do not include a specialist in the disease related to the drug they're studying, which to me seems insane. They say that it's because it reduces bias to have it that way. And so it just really felt important to me to have these people who really did not know much about CF to understand about our community. And as you heard from Gunnar, CF is an extraordinarily complex disease. There are many mutations. Even people with the exact mutations can have very different disease manifestations. And I wanted the committee to learn about the pain our community is still suffering. Pancreatitis that Gunnar has experienced, pneumothorax, hemoptysis, the coughing up of blood, people leaving careers to take care of kids, people leaving careers because they have CF and their health is declining. The high rates of depression and anxiety that we experience, how many people have lost loved ones, how many people live with survivor's guilt. I also wanted them to know about the positive impacts of Trikafta, because we are hearing stories that are pretty incredible. People who were on the transplant list and taken off the list because of the bump in lung function, people who are no longer using oxygen. My own daughter is a complete reduced dependence on insulin. Her diabetes is resolving. It's incredible. And mostly these stories of hope, a lot of people are saying for the first time, they had a sense that they had the hope of a long life. And my own daughter, Kate, has said that for the first time, she could project further into the future. So because of all that, I engaged. So last April, ICER released the evidence report on Trikafta, and the results were as expected. They minimized the patient voice, they minimized the benefits of the drug, and they declared the drug essentially not worth the cost. And really unbelievably in the report, there's an actual sentence in which they say they did this study where they looked at it as a curative therapy. Now we know Trikafta is not a cure. It's significant impact, but it's not cure. But they looked at it as a curative therapy that actually left a person with no symptoms of CF as if they were cured, and still decided that it exceeded their cost value threshold and wasn't worth it. So what that said to our community was really their personal experience makes no difference. So bringing back the importance of the patient voice in a drug assessment, ICER, really to have any credibility, should include patient groups in the deliberation and the voting process. Patients, we're just little add-ons to bring our experience, but we have no actual voice in this process. And as you know, everybody has stressed here, their use of quality puts a numerical value essentially on a life. You are given your score, and to do that is just so unbelievably, to me, immoral and unethical. It boggles the mind. And I think this is kind of intentional, and there's a, this was quoted many times, but when Duchenne muscular dystrophy had an ICER hearing for their drug, and a woman who was presenting said, this whole process is terrible. How am I supposed to make a comment on the value of my son's life? And Steve Pearson, the president of ICER, responded, I'll be honest, that's why we don't have you vote. So I'll just leave it with that. So the outcomes that ICER is using, they do not reflect what the patients see as important. Their outcomes are rigid and limited. They're not patient-derived. And so in the end, as Gunnar said, anything that matters to him is not going to be reflected in those reports, things that are very hard to quantify but are critically important. And then let's just talk money. If they really wanted to engage with patients, they would have a better understanding of the financial costs of life with CF. And this was a huge issue in 2018, and it didn't change in 2020, that they are not looking at the very broad costs involved with the treatment of CF. And I know, Mary, you absolutely know this. It's not just when you go to clinic. There are many costs. And they made these projections for a static use of Trikafta. So basically their whole analysis thought my daughter's gonna be on it now until the end of her life for decades possibly. When in fact, anybody in the CF community would say that the landscape is changing, rapidly evolving with all these new therapies in the pipeline. And the other thing is they really don't want to include real world experiences with the drug. They are rushing to judgment so that they can have their voice on what a drug should be priced at as it is released, which is ridiculous because, as we know, FDA is making decisions based on these clinical trials and that do have exclusion criteria. Exclusion criteria. And it's interesting now, just as a little aside, COVID-19, we have right now no cures for this. Remdesivir, if I'm saying this correctly, is like the only drug that so far they're seeing as a treatment. ICER's already circling the wagon to do an assessment of that in the midst of a pandemic. So they're a bit tone deaf. So ICER really, for me, it's too late, but they would have to include patients and patient care groups at the core of their assessments to have any trust or legitimacy. And the good news is we don't just need to talk about ICER. There are many other groups that are actually developing patient-driven, collaborative assessments of drug costs, and that really come from the root of patient experience. And there's, PCORI. The Food and Drug Administration is doing a very noble job. And in fact, we hosted an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting in late 2018, and Gunnar gave incredibly compelling testimony at that event, and it was credited with having played a role in the rapid fast tracking of Trikafta because the FDA really heard the patient experience and impacts and need for new therapies. So I do want to stress again, the rejection of quality is not a party issue either. There was a lot of room for many groups to jump in and denounce this, and critiques of ICER and quality of life, adjusted life year measures are generated on both sides of the political aisle. And we know Medicare is prohibited by law from using quality. It probably wouldn't stand up to an ADA challenge in court. But most excitingly, in Oklahoma recently, the governor signed into law House Bill 2587 that bans the use of quality by state agencies and third-party people who are involved with providing health care. And this really came about because of a united disability rights community, excuse me, and we can look to them as an example. I just want to reiterate what Bill mentioned. I'm really concerned not just about access to therapies for people who need them. I am very concerned that they are going to just, as Bill said, crimp the hose on innovation. And we have to remember, everybody's very excited about Trikafta, but there's 10% of our CF community who are still left out in the cold and are unable to benefit from these CFTR modulators, who are waiting for that something. And we do not want to slow the tide of creativity and innovation. So in summary, there will be more drugs coming down the pipeline, and ICER will come back to the CF community and ask us if we're going to participate and engage. And I think the next time around, would I engage? Probably not, because of all the reasons I just mentioned. I would rather share my time caring, for our CFRI's constituency. And really my hope is that rare disease groups unite to basically say, we will not play anymore. So thank you for listening.
Thank you for that, Siri. Thank you for all the work that you've done on behalf of the CF community. We're going to go ahead and move to the question and answer portion. We'd love to hear from you. So if you would like to ask a question, just go to the bottom of the screen and there's a Q&A button, and you can just go ahead and type that in there. While you all do that, we're going to take a video question from Laura Bunnell. She is the president of the Bunnell Foundation, and they provide resources, scholarships for those living with cystic fibrosis, as well as tools to help those with CF navigate the difficulties of the disease. Laura, thank you for joining us.
Thank you all so much. This is wonderful, and I have 2 daughters with cystic fibrosis who are college age, and I wondered, because the federal government has decided to leave it up to state law, how that we will be able to ban QALY in our state. And then I also wondered, because ICER is self-appointed, how do we discredit them and move forward? Thank you.
That's a great question. Does any of the panelists want to talk about how individuals on the state level can work to ban QALY?
Well, I would jump in to say Oklahoma really is a great model because, again, this movement was spearheaded by disability rights groups. And I think the key for us to move state by state is to move beyond just the CF community, connect with other rare disease groups, but also connect with other disability rights groups that may not be rare diseases, because this does impact us all. And I think, it's the domino factor. We have to, I think the key would be to pick the states where we think we can move this through and start building momentum. As for discrediting, Laura, I think the more we talk about what their agenda is, who is funding them, who benefits from these reports, I think that will go pretty far. They are very, very loud in saying they are the experts. They have this wonderful methodology to come up with this very rational decision. And we just have to continue to be loud about our displeasure with that and how inaccurate the reports are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll jump in there, and I will say that action steps that patients and families can take is really on a state level, right? So you want to make sure you're writing letters to your local representative, whether that's someone in the legislature or the governor within your state. So when Siri is talking about Oklahoma, that's the Oklahoma state government, right? So we already know that quality is banned on a federal level through the Affordable Care Act to be used in Medicare. But it's important that we feel empowered to write letters to our local and state legislators.
I agree 100%. Has to happen on all fronts. And it is an interesting thing because it is banned on the federal level, and yet there's a very gray area with state Medicaid programs. And so it is critical that the movement take place at a state level.
I just want to weigh in on that too. I agree completely with what Siri said. You know, Medicaid is a program of last resort for many patients, so they can't vote with their feet. You know, if you have a commercial health plan and, you know, you work for a big employer and they don't cover your medication, you can potentially switch to another plan. Medicaid doesn't have that opportunity. So ICER's reviews have a particularly devastating effect in the Medicaid program. And I think, you know, groups like this and other advocates should go talk to their state legislators. They're very accessible. You know, states are not big. It's not like the Congress where you can't get in to see anybody. You can go visit your legislator and say, here's my situation. Here's the bill in Oklahoma. Would you consider sponsoring something similar? That's not that hard to do.
That's great. Yes, thank you. Thank you for those questions, Laura, and for all your work that you've done on behalf of the CF community. We do have a question from Molly Riley on Facebook. She wants to know, how and where are these ICER reports used? Are there any lawmakers in the US currently proposing healthcare policy based on these reports? Great question. So how and where are the reports being used? And do we know of any lawmakers that's using these reports to advocate for healthcare policy?
Well, I'll just jump in first to say, we do know that the state of New York, when they were considering their Medicaid, their prescription drugs, actually brought in ICER to consult with them. We know the VA Association has used ICER's reports to influence what they have on their formularies. So those are the key things, but other states also do look to that. And again, it is almost always related to rare disease drugs, which, as Bill clearly explained, are in their own class in terms of cost. We will always be using quality and ICER's methodology. We will never benefit. And so the more that people use them to consult, whether or not whatever they decide with them, to me, it is incredibly frustrating that this group that really has no relevance except to those who have vested interest in reducing costs of drugs and blocking access, they're the ones that are building them up. But it is real. People are paying attention to them. Now, I will say, when I've gone and done advocacy work in different state capitals, and even last February in DC, I asked every single one of my elected officials, have you heard of ICER? And a couple of years ago, I might not have done that. It was almost like, they shall not be named. We will not give them credibility by even saying them. And now I really think it is important that people raise awareness with their electeds, because if they aren't aware of the intricacies of ICER and their agenda, it might seem like a good thing. They're just looking out for all the consumers out there. So I think it is really important that we all discredit them with make sure our elected officials who might look at those reports know what they're dealing with.
I will add to that is, more broadly, how has quality been used against people with cystic fibrosis? You have to look no further than the United Kingdom, right? Previous generations of modulators, whether it's Orkambi or Symdeki in the UK, quality has been used against those drugs to deny access to patients in the United Kingdom. And it was a sort of a tug and pull battle for many years. And only recently did those drugs become available to patients over there, overseas. You know, the real like mind-numbing piece of that is the delay, however long you want to quantify that, whether that's from the time it was approved by the FDA in the US or when it was approved in Europe for use or whatever. That time is not something that people with CF or other terminal illnesses have to spare. So the further you progress, right, we have data to suggest that the further you progress, the less lung function, the less benefit you will get from these drugs. The sooner you can start on one of these drugs, the better you are going to do, and the longer those effects will play out in your life. So the question sort of was about how quality has been used, what parts of, what are some of the ways it's been used against CF, and then that's one specific example. You also can look at Canada, where they do use a quality calculation as well, and modulator drugs are not widely available there, including Orkambi, Symdeko, and Trikafta. So there is you need to look no further than outside the US to understand how these things are directly affecting people living with cystic fibrosis.
Yeah, it's extremely heartbreaking as a parent of a child with CF, and you see children in other countries that are holding up signs begging to get access to Trikafta and Symdeko. And I mean, that's just absolutely heartbreaking. Our next question is, how can various rare disease groups join together to support appropriate legislation?
So, I mean, I can talk a little about that. The Boomer Esiason Foundation, we're part of a broader coalition of cystic fibrosis organizations that includes cystic fibrosis research, as well as Emily's Entourage is in there, as is RockCF. All of these groups, we sort of band together. We write letters to ICER when they're doing these evaluations. They're published on the reports. It's kind of like, it looks kind of nice, but at the end of the day, kind of like what Siri said, how much are they actually engaging? So, the one thing we do know from the rare disease world, and I always look back towards the HIV/AIDS movement in the 90s to see how patient advocates and disease and patient populations can really work to affect change. And it's very inspiring to see what that group of patients have done, and it's really proof to the pudding of what patients can do. It's sort of an injustice, I think, that patients need to be loud to be heard, right? It feels like the healthcare industry should just implicitly listen to patients. We're the ones who are living with these conditions. We're the ones who sit in the hospital bed. So, I do think there is proof that patient populations can move the football down the field to the goal line, to use a timely analogy. But I do think that the best way for patients to get involved on an individual level is to become involved with the organizations that are within your community, right? And we've listed a few of them. You can look at the ICER reports on their website, and you can see the organizations listed in the public comment section, or in the section where the letters are addressed. And that's where I would recommend individual patients start. And it's important that organizations do this together, because in the rare disease world, strength in numbers is something that is challenging to come by. Only 35,000 people in the US living with CF. So every person counts, every patient counts, every voice counts. And I think one of the things we take pride in at the Boomer Esiason Foundation is we attempt and try and do our best to listen to every patient voice that comes our way.
And I'll jump into that. Yes, we're part of this wonderful collaborative of CF organizations and work together, so there is strength in numbers. But I think many of us are also very engaged with other rare disease groups, so NORD and Global Genes. And it's been, I think the pandemic has been really interesting, because there have been so many issues that have come up for patients, and discriminatory policies. I mean, really many of the states have emergency plans that basically specifically listed CF as an exclusion, and when you need to prioritize the use of limited ventilators or hospital beds. They had, others didn't mention CF specifically, but had FEV1. If it was less than 30, there you were a lower priority. So these are just some of the issues that came up, but there was, what was beautiful was the coalescing of different disability rights groups who came together for letter writing campaigns and cross-fertilizing each other's movements. And I think this is something that we will move forward with. It was already happening, but I think we are seeing the impact and now new connections. I know for me personally, I have knowledge and connections with people that I didn't know prior to this, that we can work together. So I think our circle is absolutely expanding. And, you know, I will say the sickle cell groups are going through almost tag teaming the same time as CF groups with the first drug ever. And, you know, we all know about with sickle cell, just the racism that led to so little research through the years. And so finally have this drug, and ICER goes after it. It's a rare disease. It's an expensive drug. And they sucked up so much time from these groups. And in the end, they don't think it is worth the value. And, you know, just my little ding on them being tone deaf. They have their public hearing. Where did they decide to host a public hearing on sickle cell disease during the winter? In Boston. And if you know anything about sickle cell disease, it's horrific. Cold is a horrible, horrible, painful thing. So I think that was great because we really bonded through that process and communicating. And again, the more you know one person, that person knows somebody. You know one group, that group knows another group, and we can build momentum.
Yes, that's awesome. Yes, thank you. Our next question is for Dr. Bill Smith. How has ICER increased its influence over the years?
Let me just say they got a very substantial donation from the Arnold Foundation. They were a group that was started by the healthcare insurance industry. Their board was made up originally of all the CEOs of the major health insurance companies. And really their model was built, let's be frank, their model was built to help push down drug costs and leverage their negotiations against manufacturers. That's what the whole purpose of the group was. But a couple of years ago, the Arnold Foundation, for some reason, the Arnold family, who made their money in oil futures, has something against the biotech industry. They have a bias against them, and they decided drug prices are way too high. We're going to give, I think, $30 million to the Arnold Foundation. And that gave, they give $30 million to ICER from the Arnold Foundation. And that gave a substantial bandwidth to start going around the country and lobbying different states to adopt their methodology, to go to the VA and tell them to adopt their methodology. That donation really increased the visibility of ICER and its model. So they're substantially well-resourced. There's just no doubt about it. They have the backing of the health insurance industry as well as the Arnold Foundation, and they have a formidable number of staff, and they have the ability to lobby in all the state capitals around the country.
Great, thank you for that. We do have a question from a parent who has 2 children with cystic fibrosis, and she says that she's scared. This is the first time she's really hearing about ICER. And I hear you. It was only recently too that I became involved in, combating and exposing them for who they are. She wants to know, how do I know if my insurance company denies my child's prescriptions due to ICER? And then also what the name of the bill is in Oklahoma, if we have that name. So how do we know if her insurance company denies her children's prescriptions due to ICER?
Well, I would say the likelihood is, and if anybody knows more than I do, please jump right on in. But the likelihood is that any denial of a drug, if it's not a CFTR modulator, it probably hasn't been gone through an ICER review. I think, Pulmozyme would have been another big one, but I think that came out prior to ICER's existence. Thank goodness. So for them, it would be working up the chain if they have been denied for any other drug. As we all know as parents, the first thing you learn is never take no for an answer. You work your way up that chain and you probably will get results. So, so it would be interesting to know that. But in terms of the Oklahoma, it was House Bill 2587. And if you just Google Oklahoma bans QALY, QALY, you will find, you can actually pull up the actual wording of the bill, which is really wonderful wording, a great model for other states.
That's great. That's great.
I'll also add a quick comment there. I think sometimes you'll see that insurance companies or pharmacy benefit managers or the broader industry will sometimes release knowledge or release a statement, or someone will be quoted in an article suggesting that they are citing these reports in their formularies and evaluations of coverage. So that's really what I look out for when I want to see how these reports are being used. I sort of scour articles. I think there's a number of good resources out there, biopharmaceutical journals or articles or websites, blogs, things like that. And that information kind of comes out. And that's really how you will see what companies or what coverage providers or where these things are being used. The big headline, as Siri mentioned earlier, was New York State Medicaid discussion, a few years ago, where they explicitly said they were, citing these reports. So that's kind of how I keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I'll just add to that the commercial health, as Gunnar said, commercial health plans won't tell you that they're using ICER reports necessarily. If they're involved in ICER, they probably are, and many of the major companies are at least going to consult. The question is, how much do they depend on their guidance? That's the key issue. They may consider it just one factor, but then they may have a pharmacy committee of doctors that say, ICER's not right on this, so we're not going to go along with their recommendation. It's hard to know exactly in a commercial plan how much they rely on it.
Great. Thank you for that, Bill. Thank you. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get to everybody's questions, but at the end of this, there'll be a slide that will show the contact information for each of the panelists. So please feel free to reach out to them. If one thing we learned from this discussion is that there's more power in numbers, and so we want you to join with us to be able to help advocate for those in the CF community. I did want to say too that there will be an on-demand version of this recording available afterwards, and there will also be available on the Pioneer Institute Facebook page. Again, I'd like to thank the Pioneer Institute for sponsoring this event and the Boomer Esiason Foundation. Thank you all so much for joining us. We know that you are busy. We hope that this was informative and educational, and we hope too that you'll join with us on this fight to help the CF community. Thank you so much.